Good morning and welcome to the 2020 Salazar event, celebrating the life and legacy of trailblazing journalist Ruben Salazar. I'm Lori Ochoa, LA Times Arts and Entertainment Editor, and the current president of Latino Journalists of California, CCNMA, the oldest Latino journalism organization in the country. Today, we have a special program to honor Ruben Salazar's work and the winners of the 2020 Ruben Salazar Journalism Awards. We'll name the winners at noon and join us at 11 a.m. for a look behind the scenes of the LA Times Chicano Moratorium Project. Robert Lopez, who wrote one of the key pieces about Ruben Salazar for the series, will be moderating that talk. But first, I want to introduce Daniel Hernandez, who is leading this morning's conversation with Cecilia Vega and Jennifer Medina, two powerful Latina journalists we followed this year as they covered the never-ending 2020 presidential election. Daniel is a Los Angeles Times cultural reporter who was editor of Vice Mexico, a producer and correspondent for Vice News, editor of the mighty LA Taco, and writer for the New York Times, LA Weekly, Slate Los Angeles, and he's also the author of Down and Delirious in Mexico City, the Aztec Metropolis in the 21st Century, a fantastic book that I highly recommend. Daniel, take it away.
Thank you, Lori. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'm very thrilled to be moderating this panel today with two wonderful journalists. And we're here to talk with them about what happened this year in the 2020 presidential election, and also their perspective and their experiences leading up to this really monumental race. Let me just briefly introduce our guest today. We have Cecilia Vega, who is senior White House correspondent for ABC News. Cecilia is a native of the San Francisco Bay Area and started her career in print journalism, if I get this right, with the San Bernardino Sun. She was also a scholarship recipient of CCNMA, and we're going to talk a little bit about their backgrounds and their histories. And also Jennifer Medina, who is a national correspondent for the New York Times. Jenny is also a SoCal native and also a longtime friend and scholarship recipient of CCNMA. She's also worked in New York City, in Connecticut, and covered New York City public schools. And they have really interesting perspectives that I think kind of bookend the election that we've been also enraptured with understanding and following this year, even during all of the tumult and change that has occurred because of the pandemic. Cecilia is right there in the thick and the cauldron, really in the belly of the beast in DC, covering a White House that has been really volatile and really hostile to journalists and the work that we do as the fourth estate in this country and in our democracy. And Jenny, on the other hand, has really been in the trenches talking to voters across the country about their concerns and about where their political leanings took them in such a dynamic and ever-changing year. So I wanted to start with Cecilia, if we could, and if you could tell us a little bit about your road to journalism. I think it's really important for especially young journalists and aspiring journalists to hear perhaps when you decided you wanted to be a journalist, and what was the pathway, in a few lines, if you could, that took you to ABC and to DC.
Hi everybody. It's an unconventional path, and so anytime anybody asks, like, how did you do this? It's a path that kind of went like this, and I think now that I look back on it, my best advice is to just say yes and try things when people ask you to try crazy things at work, because you never know. For my career anyway, I said yes to a lot of things I thought I wasn't necessarily qualified for, or moved to different cities that I didn't think I wanted to live in, and they've led to just really wonderful things. But it's a road that literally started with CCNMA. I am completely indebted to this organization and just wholeheartedly support everything you guys are doing, because You mentioned I'm from the Bay Area. I didn't grow up with money. My family didn't have any money. I'm the first person to graduate from college, and I wasn't one of those kids that had the opportunity to do internships for free when I was in school. And I didn't graduate with a giant stack of clips. I was a newspaper reporter at the time, print journalism major. And when I went to go get my first job, often I was told, like, we needed to see more evidence of what you could do. And I'd written for the college papers and all of that stuff, but you got to have the proof to show that you can do the job. But CCNMA, I applied for this scholarship. I got it. A man named Kevin Olivas, who was with CCNMA at the time, saw something in me and kept my resume, kept my file, and literally picked up the phone and said, I know some folks, I know a couple of places that could get you some job interviews. And he did. He picked up the phone and took a chance on a kid who had zero work experience. And I got my interview at the San Bernardino Sun. And I remember having been told in college by a professor, like, if you make it to a newspaper that has an elevator, a second floor or higher, you've made it. And the Sun had 2 floors, and I was like, yes, this is like huge. And like, I covered the Fontana School Board, and it was my first beat. And to this day, it was one of the best jobs I've ever had. I mean, like, it was like being in college with a bunch of young reporters, and it was so fun. And you did it all back then. I mean, God, I'm gonna sound really old, but we had like one computer with the internet on it, and we would stand in line to use it. But then that just progressed. I mean, I said, I ended up down the road. Jenny and I worked together. I was doing a fellowship at the New York Times for a few months, and that's where we met, which feels like a gazillion years ago now. And it's just been a crazy path. I ended up at the San Francisco Chronicle, and then
how did you make that leap to a
bigger paper?
Or
yeah,
to broadcast?
To broadcast. So we all know the industry's changed a lot. And when I was at the Chronicle, I was covering California politics, and I would often do a lot of kind of talking head things on local news for whatever stories I was working on. And the local ABC affiliate called, and they said, you should come and try to do broadcast. And I was like, I don't know how to comb my hair. I never straighten my hair. Does not look like this naturally. I'd never straightened my hair a day in my life. I was like, I'm not doing that. And then the business just kept changing. And I thought, God, let me call these guys back and see if they'll have me, because the newspaper industry was changing so much. And they literally sent me to, like, I call it broadcast boot camp, where they showed me how to walk and talk and write for TV. And I was in local news for 2 years, and it's a crazy story. Diane Sawyer saw me do a live shot in San Francisco, and ABC called one day, and they were like, can you come to New York and interview? And I found myself literally sitting across from Diane Sawyer. She grabbed my hands. She's such a sweetheart. She's a mentor to this day. And she was holding my hands, and she kept saying, now is the time. You have to come and work for network news. And I just kept thinking, she completely thinks I have some kind of glandular disorder because I'm calm. So sweaty. There you have it. It's been almost 10 years. Here I am. It's a crazy story. Like I said, just say yes.
I love that. And Jenny, you and I kind of started around the same time. I remember meeting you really early on, and really hoping that one day that we would work together. And we actually did briefly last fall here in the LA Bureau of the New York Times, and I was a fellow at the Styles desk. But tell us about your experience, starting out from Riverside, correct, to USC, and landing at, one of the most prestigious news organizations in the world. Tell us about that.
So like Cecilia, my story starts completely with CCNMA. And I also didn't know we had the San Bernardino Sun in common, which I'll get to in 1 second. I discovered journalism in high school. And at the time, there was an incredibly strong CCNMA chapter in Riverside, mostly people who worked at the Press Enterprise and the San Bernardino Sun. And several of those people, who I am still friends with to this day, took an interest in me and took me under their wings. And I went to a CCNMA boot camp in San Diego as a high school student, and then was committed, was just like completely in love. I thought I could just get paid to talk to people for a living. That seemed like completely amazing to me. And my first internship was after high school. The San Bernardino Sun had something called, I think it was called High School Journalism All-Stars. And the chance to work at a daily paper, like Cecilia, I remember going into this building and thinking it was like incredibly glamorous, and my heart just totally in my throat and being so nervous and freaked out. And people there were just incredibly nurturing and wonderful. One of my first memories too is covering a school board meeting and coming back from that school board meeting and wanting to eat some dinner first. And the editor said, "Are you crazy? You have to write before you can eat anything." And I just always have remembered that lesson. So my path was kind of on the straight and narrow. I don't think it's even honestly possible to do it anymore, unfortunately, because of the way the industry has changed so much. I worked at the Sun, then I interned at increasingly larger papers all through college, and then landed at the New York Times right after I graduated. And all of my internships were paid. There was no way I could work unpaid. And all of them came, frankly, through CCNMA job fairs. So I feel incredibly indebted and grateful for this organization. But I started as an intern at the Times and then have been there ever since, which is a fairly unusual thing. And have had lots of great experiences and plenty of ups and downs too.
And Jenny, I remember a couple of years ago we were just kind of chatting, and you were thinking about moving back to Los Angeles. You had been based in New York for many years. And the newspaper was asking you to join the politics team and kind of throw your hat in the ring and help cover the campaign. And initially, I remember you, if you don't mind me sharing, were a little trepidatious about that. Tell us about how, I guess, what convinced you to start covering the campaign, and, initially, what were some of the challenges that you faced in trying to bring your touch and of journalism and of the kind of stories that you find to this very big and unwieldy story?
Sure. So my first experience with politics was, I'm not even going to say what year, a long time ago, covering Albany. And then I moved to Connecticut to cover a Senate race and covered the state capitol there for a little while. And my experience with it, frankly, at the time was not enjoyable. I was really interested in talking to sort of regular people, and I felt quite cynical about politics for quite a long time. And in my previous job as an LA-based correspondent, I did politics now and then, but it wasn't a full-time job. And the thought of following a candidate day in and day out was just not appealing. I mean, lots of people think this is incredibly fun, and I can understand that. It just wasn't appealing to me. So when they asked me to cover politics, I really said no, wanted to say no. But, when the executive editor tells you you have to do something, there's not really any arguing. I needed to stay employed. So I said yes. And the approach, I was very lucky in that I could be very honest with my editor in saying what I wanted to do. And the benefit, frankly, of doing it now at this point in my career, rather than early on when they initially tried to get me to do it, is that I had a little bit more choice. And so what I tried to do was to approach it from a slightly different point of view and mostly focusing on voters. There were two things that I think that I was really grateful to be able to do. One is to cover it from LA and not be in DC and New York. The vast majority of reporters who are covering national politics are in DC and New York. And I think being here gives us a slightly different perspective on the country and on politics. So that was one thing. And then again, just being able to mostly focus on people and voters and sort of what they think. And those two things combined, frankly, also allowed me to focus a lot on Latino voters.
Mm-hmm. And Cecilia, back to you real quick. You've covered so much crazy stuff all over the world. I mean, you've been in Rome, you've been all over Mexico. I think you went deep sea diving for a piece once, and you also logged in lots of miles with candidates, with the people, sort of the main players of this massive story. Were you ever, I don't want to use the word intimidated, but were you ever
you could use the word intimidated.
Okay. I was going to say, I mean,
it's accurate.
I mean, you're right
yes,
up there,
also.
right? You're right up there with, the Clintons, the contentious 2016 Democratic primary. That must have probably prepared you, I imagine, for 2019 and 2020. But tell us about how you first started covering national politics, right up there with the big players.
Yeah, you know what's funny? I don't know that my bosses would appreciate me confessing this. Look, I'm the senior White House correspondent. I'm going into another administration. I cover the White House. I mean, you said it, I covered campaigns. I don't think of myself as a political reporter. I think of myself, because I never want to be like the conversation that Jenny had with her bosses. It's a delicate one. I've kind of tried to make it very clear of like the lanes I want to go in when it comes to covering politics. There are some people who live and die for getting on campaign planes, and like there are people who are in their 70s who have done it like cycle after cycle after cycle, and it becomes this kind of addiction. I don't have that, and I also never want to be the person who's inside the Capitol Rotunda plucking out, you know, all 435 House members by sight, because like that just doesn't appeal to me. I think of myself as kind of the national reporter who loves telling the big story of the day. My career goal has always just wanted to be one of the first people who gets the first phone call when there is a big story by the newsroom, you know? And it just so happens that between the 2016 campaign and this cycle, the last 6 to 8 years, the primary news story in our country has been politics based, because of who Donald Trump is and the oxygen that he has sucked up in terms of politics. So I just kind of landed in this job. I don't feel like a political reporter. And so I try to approach it from the 30,000 foot view, in that I always think when I'm in the White House briefing room and I'm asking a question of the press secretary or even the president, and this may sound really naive, but I ask, what would my mom want to know? Mm-hmm. My mom, who lives in Oakland, California, and, you know, reads the papers and watches CNN, and she's an active news consumer, but is just very much, how does this relate to me? How is this healthcare cuts? How does DACA? How did any policy relate to me? And that's how I've approached it, just from a personal level. I find it really fulfilling. But I also think, like, if I could just toot Jenny's horn, because she would never do it herself, she's literally, I think, led the way in terms of how you should cover politics in this country. It's from the inside out. It's from voters, and she's really, from a broadcast perspective, like, changed the narrative and changed the focus for a lot of our coverage, I think, because until you came along and started covering politics like this, we weren't hearing from Latino voters, not as just a story, but these are just voters. This is not a narrow beat anymore. This is American politics as we know it. And it needed someone, this is why representation, I think, is so important. It needed someone like Jenny to come in and kind of shake that up and pitch. We should be covering these stories from not just I have to be in Washington because I have to go to the White House every day, but we have to be covering politics from around the rest of the country. That it's voters, it's America. And I think for a long time, we've missed that entirely. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think of myself as a political reporter. I still don't. I'm going to another cycle, and it's really just about what does my mom think?
Right.
Like that think every day.
And you're there. I mean, you're in the White House. It's a place that not many people ever get to see. What was it like? What has it been like going in there as a Latina, as a brown person? In a country that still so stubbornly insists on looking at race in many ways and representation as a black and white issue. Do you feel that you have gotten not treated differently, but that there are different kinds of expectations from sort of the standard kind of political class and media class as you approach the story as, a Latina from the Bay,
Yeah. Back to my mom, she didn't want me to take this job covering Trump. So I was on the Clinton campaign. Traditionally in broadcast, the person who covers the candidate that wins ends up going to the White House. We kind of shook things up a little bit. And my mom was like adamant. She really did not want me to cover this administration. She said, "You're the three things he hates the most. You're Mexican, you're a woman, and you're a journalist." She was genuinely fearful for my safety. And finally, I worked up the nerve to tell her, but Mom, like, what better person than to sit in the front row of that briefing room and be those three things? And And I think it has helped me in a lot of ways to be in there as, if I'm not mistaken, the only Mexican American for sure. You know, when DACA started to die down as a story, or family separations started to die down as a story, stories that I just find personally interesting and really on the front burner in terms of things I think we should be holding the administration accountable for. As that correspondent who sits in the front row, you can decide. It's a very powerful feeling. You decide what you're going to ask the administration that day, and you can ask about one topic or you can ask about the other. And I just never let up on those topics, especially family separation, especially in a news cycle where things change so much. You could easily, we lose track of these stories, and you're on to one big scandal from the next. So personally, that's, you know, I think it's been an important perspective to bring into that briefing room. Look, I think I can say objectively, this is an administration and a president that has a particularly contentious relationship with women of color. Some of his nastiest attacks with the press corps have been directed at women of color. That part is not fun. I mean, look, we travel with security. It's crazy. If we cover a presidential briefing, we have to have security with us now. That's not just me, that's most network outlets. I for a long time was very, very fearful that someone would get hurt in the press corps. I mean, people had. I was at a rally where some crazy jumped over the barricades and like beat the crap out of a cameraman for a local network. So yeah, I mean, it certainly came with risks. Throw in COVID, like that's a whole other thing like that of risks in terms of deciding whether to go to the White House. But for me, it was so important. This has been the most contentious beat I've ever covered, but also the most fulfilling, because I think like as a Mexican American woman in that front row, I brought a perspective that was an important one that needed to be in there. So sorry, Mom, she was nervous. But
Well, I mean, there was that one moment a couple of years ago when the president singled you out and tried to bully you on national television, a press conference, and sort of suggested that you couldn't, quote, think. What was running through your mind? How did you keep your cool? Because I don't know how I would have. And how do you kind of think of this person as the effect that he's had on our jobs and all of our jobs as we walk through this country in this moment?
Well, you know, the most indelible image from that experience is not what the president said to me or kind of what was going through my mind. It's really actually kind of messed up, and it's bothersome. It's the people that were standing behind him, like Mnuchin and like all these officials who were laughing and they thought it was funny. And I was like, God, this is just really ugly.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, like, yeah, I was hot, right? There was a lot I wanted to say that obviously I couldn't, but I just knew professionally there are reporters in the White House press corps who give it right back, right? And it turns into kind of this, for lack of a better term, a pissing match between people in the particularly broadcast, I think, like some broadcast folks and the White House. And it becomes this kind of ugly sparring match. That's not my style. I think, again, if we're going at this in terms of getting voters the information, the American public the information they need, it is really easy to fight back with them because, you know, when they're calling you the enemy of the American people, when they're using personal slurs and saying you don't think, you never do. But at the end of the day, is if I get in the mud with the president of the United States, that's just going to become a TV moment that lasts for 15 seconds. The better thing is to like keep going. I'm there to ask questions. And so I just remember telling myself, don't sit down. Do not cede this turf to him. Keep asking your question. And that's what I just kept doing. I mean, he didn't answer it at the moment, but he did circle back to me, and I was able to get the question in. And I commend my colleagues who have that style with this administration, because it's the harder road to take, I think, to not duke it out with them. Yeah. You could easily.
Yeah, wow. And Jenny, part of your role has been to get out there. I mean, I feel that in the past couple of years, you've been hopping on planes, and one moment you're in Texas and another moment you're in Nevada or Florida or other spots. Talk to us a little bit about, well, I think there are two key highlights that jump out at me in the kind of stories that you've been doing. One was last year during the awful terror attack against Latinos in El Paso, Texas. And you were out there for the New York Times on a breaking moment, and you were just talking to a victim, and your emotions really came through. And I felt for a lot of people, and this is one of those moments that, like the moment that Cecilia had with the president, was like a completely unscripted and raw and real, but I think it reflected the kind of toll that the news can take on us as we report it and produce it and present it to our audiences. And also, again, for the Daily, for the New York Times podcast, when you were out here in Los Angeles talking to undecided Latino voters, ranging from the kind of Paisa style immigrant kind of old man voters to like the young hardcore kind of leftist activists who were organizing for the Sanders campaign, and the real kind of acrobatics that people were doing in their minds trying to decide where to cast their vote and how, because I felt like they really understood the strength of the Latino vote as it was approaching this very momentous election. Talk to us about those experiences and what you were trying to get out there to readers and to listeners who are not familiar with Latinos on a day-to-day basis.
Let's see. I'll talk about the California one first because it's a little easier. I think living here, I alluded to this before. I mean, I'm speaking to an audience, I imagine, of most of the people who are in California. Like, we just absorb a different zeitgeist, and we're in a place where Latinos have been sort of ascending to power for quite a long time now. And I think, as you mentioned, sort of, especially in the younger population, really realize that power that they have as voters in particular. And so what was so interesting to me about covering the California primary is, like, people knew. It wasn't like they had to be convinced to vote. It wasn't like they had to be convinced to tune in. They were looking at an administration that, as Cecilia just so eloquently talked about, had completely demonized them, right? And so they knew they wanted to fight back. They wanted to vote against it in some way, but the question was how. And listening to people's, as you called it, acrobatics, was fascinating. And people are not, I think one thing that I've learned over the last year and a half is that voters are not linear sort of ideological thinkers. Most voters are not. Most voters have like some ideology, but then there's just this emotional piece. And so I talked to, like you call them Pisces, like all the old, I mean, they weren't really that old, but older men who were like, Biden's my guy, like he's the guy who's going to win. And then they're like sons and daughters who are like, no, Sanders is who's going to represent us. He's going to fight for us and he's going to give us all these things. Like those conflicts that weren't really conflicts within families, like this sort of joking thing, was just so much fun and such a rich story that I think people on the East Coast, honestly, I'm way oversimplifying, but like that my editors can really gloss over and simplify. So it's really a privilege to be able to tell that story. And El Paso was undeniably like one of the hardest moments of my career. I, as a national reporter, and I'm sure this is true for Cecilia, because it's true for so many of us, had covered so many mass shootings. I once tried to count and I lost track, but it's easily more than a dozen, where I've, shown up on the scene, have to talk to witnesses, have to talk to victims' families, and the devastation that brings is just astonishing. And of course it's true for murderers and things as well, and I've done many of those, but there's something just particularly jarring about these mass casualty events. And I was covering Beto at a candidate forum. I was just following him along for profile in Las Vegas, and we got news of this shooting. And I remember sitting in this room with hundreds of other reporters and knowing, like, I'm writing a profile on Beto. I have to get on a plane as soon as he does and go to El Paso. Like, there was just no question in my mind. And so I did that, and I sobbed on the plane the entire time, and got to El Paso. It was a Saturday night. The shooting happened on a Saturday. And then the next morning woke up and was watching the talking head shows on all the networks, and then had to go out to a press conference where Beto was speaking. And I turned to somebody who was standing like really close to me, and she was sort of, you could tell she was very emotional. And I said, "Are you from here?" And she said, "No, I'm from Parkland." And my heart just like jumped into my throat. I mean, I knew immediately, "You're from Parkland, like, what are you doing here?" And it turned out that her son, whose name was Joaquin, had been killed in Parkland, and it was supposed to be, it would have been his 18th birthday. And so they came to El Paso to go volunteer in Juarez in his honor. And just the clashing of events was too much for me, honestly. Like, I just lost it. I mean, it was like a moment that I couldn't have predicted, where I just lost it. And I was so nervous about it and sort of ashamed of it for a really long time. And now, a year and a half later, like, it's just reality. I mean, it's just reality.
I wanted, if we could, because you guys are the experts here, talk about, get some analysis in here. I mean, we're in this moment where the sitting president refuses to recognize the results of the election. And Cecilia, you've been dealing with him and been in the room with him and been in this adversarial role with the White House and with the whole communications team that they have there. What do you think that they are trying to do at this point? And how, and I suppose, the question for you and your editors and your news directors has to be, how do you cover something like this, where the very core of our institutions are being questioned by the most powerful person in the country and all the people who are enabling him? Is it like walking on glass, like tiptoeing, or are you as a journalist really trying to dig in and maybe challenge this administration to be more forthright with the American people and with the press in particular? What's your approach right now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything 6 years in, if you throw in the campaign, that any reporter in this country could do or say to, make them be forthright. Like, at this point, like that bridge done sailed a long time ago. Where we are, look, undeniably, Donald Trump has changed the way that we cover presidents and probably in a permanent way. And we had to learn to cover him. At the very beginning, he would tweet and we would like jump, and it would, I was doing like updates on stories. I would, do a hit at 7 o'clock in the morning at GMA, and then he would tweet by 7:30 and I was back on and updating him. It was just like this like insane pace of news. We've dialed that back a lot, but what has happened in terms of how we cover him, and it's just a really bizarre way to write a story, and even to interview them in real time in a briefing room or something like that, or ask questions of them, is I'm like an on the spot fact checker now. Mm-hmm. And that is so hard. Like, you have to know your, like, in a very serious way, because what they want you to do is mess up. Like, really, like they make the error and you're just giving them a gift. And so I write these pieces, and if I use a quote from the president, or a soundbite from the president that has something that's factually inaccurate, right out of that, I have to say, that's not true. I mean, literally in every story I say, but that's not true. The reality is da, 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 da. I'm like this constant like ping pong of fact versus fiction. Sometimes we're kind of at the point where we won't even often include these fact-free statements that he makes, because they're just so completely egregious. There's no basis in reality, particularly when it comes to where we are with the state of the election. We're just not even using it. And it's strange. It's strange to have a president give a briefing from the White House like he did 2 or 3 days ago, and held up a bunch of charts that was just full of mistruths that we as a network, none of the networks even took it. We're at the point where we're just not even running this stuff because it's just not true. It's not grounded in reality. So, you know, and there may be some who hear what I'm saying and think of that as opinion, but it's not. It's black. We're in black and white worlds right now. Joe Biden is the president of elect. He will be the president when he is sworn in. Donald Trump did not win a re-election. Donald Trump has no basis to say that this election is rigged. There is no evidence whatsoever. Judge after judge after judge across the country has said there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. That is just not true. And so we're kind of at the point where we're moving on. Like, if he says something that's different, we'll use it. But at this point, you know, we're focused in terms of our coverage on how Joe Biden is going to tackle this pandemic at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And is he going to be able to get vaccines to people at this point? Not that Donald Trump is angry that he's not getting the credit for the vaccines that are about to come down. It's been a wild ride. We've had to learn as we go. And I still think we are sort of learning, because we're in uncharted waters here with these claims that the president is making about the status of our election and our electorate and our democracy. And frankly, it's just, I mean, I say this in an unbiased way. It's dangerous what he's saying and doing in terms of creating doubt about the foundation of our democracy, our democratic system.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for so long, the standards of American journalism was whatever the president says is newsworthy. But when the president is saying things that are false or not true and purposefully misconstruing and misinforming the public, well, it does raise, it's a new bar really for journalists and for people who are directly there. I'm just also very curious, even when the White House outbreak occurred, what did you do and how did you, I mean, did your bosses say don't set foot in there again? Or, I mean, how are you doing the pandemic protocols now with this White House, which is just so reckless? I mean, I'm just the literal internal behavior of the White House just appears to be so reckless in terms
I mean,
of
that's just what you're saying. Again, it's fact. It's not opinion. It has been reckless, and there have been at least 2, maybe 3 mass outbreaks on the grounds of the White House. I've had coworkers from the White House get sick, sources that have gotten sick, multiple sources that have gotten sick because of contact that they've had at the White House. When it you know, it was kind of a slow trickle, right? The way all of the COVID thing happened and came down, and the president was doing these briefings at the very beginning, and there would be like people packed behind him, like zero social distancing, but not just that, like you just literally never saw folks on the grounds of the White House wear a mask, even when it got to the point where Fauci and everybody was saying you have to wear a mask. They just wouldn't do it. Or you would get on Air Force One, and we travel with the president when he leaves and go to these rallies during the campaign, and people were not wearing masks. Finally, I think when we saw these people getting sick, the first round was the Secret Service getting sick. And when you go to the grounds of the White House as a reporter, you get wanded by Secret Service, you're up close with Secret Service. And ABC, to their credit, early on said, this is not safe. You guys should not be going there. For essentially a backdrop White House live shot, which is often what we would do. I mean, in the White House press corps, you have offices, and every outlet has their office, and traditionally you stay and you spend the day there working, and then you go back into the areas that you have access to, and you're kind of sourcing in person and stuff like that. But ABC said, no more, this is not safe. You go when you have to go because we're pool and covering the president that day, and you have access to the president. But other than that, like, I haven't been to the White House. I haven't been there since election day. Yeah, I have not. I'm doing most of my live shots from our bureau in Washington, which is a couple blocks away. And I go when I need to. We go when we have a briefing seat. We have a limited pool rotation now. So the White House press corps has done a really great job of mitigating this. Like we don't have, it's not the mass 50 people that you normally would have covering the president every day. It's a scaled back pool size to like 12 people. So you don't have access to a briefing seat every time there's a briefing. You don't have access to the president every time he calls you into the Oval for safety reasons, because people, frankly, were getting sick. But to ABC's credit, they said it's just not safe. So we go when we have to, when we have face-to-face time with the president, and then we all get tested. But even then, I mean, we've seen the outbreak at the White House. They test everybody close to the president regularly, and they all still got it. So he himself.
It's wild.
Yeah, it's wild.
And Jenny, you were in Arizona, right, on election night? Tell us about your reaction to the kind of I would say, naive national narrative that emerged immediately after the election results came in which it became clear that Latino voters, quote unquote, were quote unquote not a monolith, which is now almost a cliche to say, and that we learned that voters in Florida in particular had helped tip that state, that swing state, toward Donald Trump, but that, remarkably, Latino voters on the other side of the country, in the state of Arizona, after so many years that Latinos had been demonized by Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the hard right Republican politicians in that state, had flipped that state, apparently, to Joe Biden. What were you talking with your colleagues and with your editors, and what did you want to get out in front of the New York Times readers and national audiences about those results and what they said or not said about Latinos?
So in the run up to the election, I had written a bunch of stories, including one that was really based in Arizona. Like Cecilia's talking about COVID, part of my protocols with COVID is that I stopped flying for the most part, but I could drive to Arizona. So I spent a lot of time between May and November in Arizona. So I wrote a story about the macho appeal of Donald Trump. And I had gone to an event with a MMA fighter, an undocumented Mexican MMA fighter who was for Donald Trump. So I had written these stories sort of getting at the fact that there was an appeal of Donald Trump within the Latino community. And the day before election day, I messaged my editor and I said, this is just a random thought that may or may not be true, but it's possible that Latinos will be the reason Trump wins Florida and Texas. And I was driving to the place I was going to hang out with on election night, and she called me and she's like, well, you might have been right. And I spent most of election night at Congressman Ruben Gallego's house. He's a congressman from Phoenix, and he was having a sort of watch party at his house. And as the returns from Florida started to come in, there was like a lot of like, what the hell in the room. And I was in the corner with my computer, like kind of watching returns and watching what was going on Twitter and seeing this like crazy, what I thought was like a crazy narrative emerge of like, oh my God, Latinos aren't a monolith. I mean, it seems so incredibly naive and almost insulting, frankly. Yeah. And then the fun part was, I love this part. So then the Arizona results were coming in, and Fox News, of all places, called Arizona for Biden. And the congressman said, Arizona just fucking saved America. Excuse my language. But the dissonance in that room between, like, on the one hand, they had to deal with the reality that like Florida lost in part because of Latinos, because of Cubans, because of Colombians, because of Venezuelans. And at the same time, their work and really the work of activists on the ground had delivered Arizona. So that sort of cognitive dissonance was really strange. I talked to one person who leads a national Latino organization who said to me, well, Latinos were all for Biden as long as you take out the Colombians and the Cubans.
Right.
Like, how do you do that? That doesn't make sense. But the national media narrative honestly drove me up the wall. Like, there was a column in the Washington Post that said the national media has a problem with Latinos. And it was by Margaret Sullivan, who I deeply respect and admire. But it was also like, what are you talking about? I'm sorry, you didn't read the stories, but there were stories in the New York Times, in the LA Times, in the Miami Herald, in the Washington Post that all got at this. So the way that what that showed me about the media ecosystem is that we are still so siloed. Like, people read things that reinforce their own worldview. So, to me, that showed Margaret Sullivan is reading a lot of, frankly, white guys on Twitter. And not a lot of the other media that's doing a great job. Frankly, Latino media who's doing a great job.
Yeah, and there's so much nuance there with ethnicity and with color, with race, with region, and so on. I'm just so glad that you two are out there reflecting that diversity and that nuance. Really quick, I wanted to, if we still have time, open up to some questions from some participants who are with us, if that's okay. Makalo, do we have any questions or any topics that we would like to discuss further?
So attendees, if you're watching right now, please put your question in the chat box to the bottom right of your screen. If those pop up, you can see them for yourself, Daniel.
Great. Okay, well, in the meantime, just a little bit of trivia. Cecilia, what are some of the things that you do to get through? I mean, what are your
Well, I
life
thought
hacks?
this was going to be like state capitals or something. I was like, shit,
No.
already.
I want Cecilia's secrets.
Wine.
Wine, of course, I bet.
Wait, sorry, what was the question? What do I do to what? Stay
Yeah, I
safe.
mean, what are some of your what are some of the ways that you create balance for yourself? It's one of the most high-profile jobs that there is anywhere in our profession to cover DC, and in particular to cover the White House. How do you stay balanced and sane through all this?
Yeah,
Especially
I
as
don't.
you're-
I'm not balanced. I'm neither balanced nor sane. So, I mean, I got two phones right here on a Saturday. He's tweeted 52 minutes ago. I got to watch the alerts. I'm like, it's bad. Pavlov's dog. Like, if the tweet comes in, and I'm like messed up.
Is he nice? Is the president a cool guy off camera? I've heard this.
So, the one thing I will say about Trump, and I think it's the reason he, got more votes than any Republican in history. He is what you see is what you get. Like there with Obama, for example, people always thought, oh, he's so cool. He must be so nice behind the scenes. Like it wasn't warm and fuzzy with Obama behind the scenes. With Trump, it's like, if he's in a shitty mood, he's going to be really shitty to you behind the scenes. If he's in a good mood, if he likes the piece, and I will tell you, he watches every story that everybody does. So like, if he liked the piece you did that morning on Good Morning America, or that night on World News, or the piece that, the piece that somebody wrote that was on the front, Maggie Haberman at the Times, who he's like obsessed with and reads every single word letter that he writes. Like, he'll pull you out in the Oval, and like he did it to Kristen Welker at NBC the other day. They have this like antagonistic relationship, and he in the Oval Office, he was like, great debate, and it's like, oh, I thought you hated us. So it really just depends on the day. He can be like a very like aw shucks kind of guy behind the scenes, but he can also, give it right to you and not hold back. So
we have a couple of quick questions. Jenny and Cecilia, how do you see the immigration debate? I mean, I don't even know if you can call it a debate at this point, but how do you see the immigration issue being playing out in Biden's first 100 days? And another quick question that participant has for both of you is if you will keep covering politics moving forward. Jenny, do you want to go real quick?
Sure. I mean, a lot of people who I spend a lot of time with are the immigration activists, particularly here at West. And I think there is a lot of desire to see major change really quickly. And I am not at all convinced that that major change will happen. And so I think we're going to see very quickly a split within the Democratic Party. Immigration advocates were polite and supportive of Biden, but I think we're going to see really quickly them register their dissatisfaction. And to the question, am I going to keep covering this? Yes, I'm basically going to keep doing my same job of covering the perspective of voters with a particular focus out West. And, we were talking before, I don't know what exactly that looks like. It is a totally different world, but I think the divisions that we have in this country are still going to be here even after Trump leaves office.
Cecilia?
yeah, same. I'm staying. I'll do Biden for the foreseeable future. Biden has said he wants to deal with DACA on day one. He may not actually have to do anything with DACA, given the ruling that just came down 2 days ago from the federal judge that basically put the kibosh on everything the Trump administration has been trying to do. It will depend on whether the administration wants to file an appeal, and then Biden would have to act. The Times had a really great piece today that talked about if, no matter what Biden tries to do, some of the effects that the Trump administration has had on immigration is already baked in the cake in terms of people just not seeking, people being terrified to come out of the shadows. We saw this during COVID, like undocumented immigrants particularly, would not even seek treatment for COVID for fear of deportation. So even if, as Jenny says, I am dubious that Biden will be able to do everything he thinks he wants to do, whether he even wants to do some of these things early on in like the first 100 days when it comes to immigration, especially what happens in Georgia will depend a lot on how successful Biden will be, whether he has a split Congress or not. You know, the damage may be done already in terms of people just being scared and not wanting to come out of the shadows and seeking the services that they're entitled to. The Democrats, I do think we're sort of, as Jenny just alluded to, already starting to see some cracks in the ranks. The progressives, particularly Latinos, even in Congress, particularly, are frustrated that they're not seeing more representation in the early cabinet choices that Biden is putting forward, especially about Latinos. You know, COVID is going to be the first and foremost item on the agenda, and then the economy. And so if folks are really hopeful that they will start to tick immigration related issues off in the first 100 days, I just don't know that that's going to happen as much as they would like to, as quickly as they would like to see it done.
We have a couple of nice comments directed to you two, praising you for really bringing visibility for Latinas, and Cecilia, you in particular, for being one of the few Mexican-American women there in the White House. I want to thank you both for joining me and for answering these questions. All of you who are on the event right now, please join us at our next panel at 11 a.m. Jennifer Medina, New York Times, thank you so much. Cecilia Vega, you were also our Latina Journalist of the Year this year, Jenny, for CCNMA, so congratulations again for that. And Cecilia Vega, Senior White House Correspondent for ABC News, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward. Thank you. And we're looking forward.
You guys are a bunch of badasses. Thank you. I'm just like happy to be a part of it, so thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone. And we'll see you very soon. Makalo, take it away.